It started with a hiss, faint at first, and then a sharp rustle through the dry grass that bordered the yard. The homeowner, a man who had always loved unusual pets, had been living peacefully in the quiet suburban neighborhood for years. His property, a corner lot with thick shrubs and a high wooden fence, had become somewhat of a private sanctuary. Inside, he kept his reptiles, carefully housed in secure enclosures that met every safety regulation. There were pythons, corn snakes, and even a few rare species collected over the years. To him, they were fascinating companions, creatures misunderstood by most, but endlessly captivating. The neighbors didn't often notice, or at least didn't seem to care. That was until Karen moved in across the street. She was the kind of neighbor who believed every little detail of the block needed to meet her personal standards. The lawn length, the paint shade, even the types of cars parked outside, nothing escaped her scrutiny. And when she caught wind of the reptiles in her new neighbor's home, her focus turned into an obsession. Karen had never been fond of animals, much less snakes. The very thought of them made her uneasy. From the moment she learned that her neighbor kept them, she started spreading whispers. She spoke to other neighbors on evening walks, mentioning words like dangerous and unsafe. She described visions of the snakes escaping, slithering under doors, hiding in garages, or creeping into children's play areas. The neighbors listened politely, but never seemed to take her as seriously as she wanted. Her frustration only grew when she noticed how well kept the property across from hers looked. The reptile enthusiast was meticulous, always ensuring his yard was trimmed, his fence freshly painted, and his driveway spotless. It was hard for Karen to argue about appearances, so she doubled down on the snakes. She began filing complaints, first to the HOA, then to the local authorities. She claimed she could hear them at night, claimed they were getting loose, and even swore she saw one basking on the sidewalk. Every claim was investigated, and every time nothing was found. The snakes were secure, well-fed, and kept in enclosures that met every legal requirement. But Karen wasn't satisfied. Her complaints escalated into confrontations. She would stand at the edge of her driveway, glaring across the street whenever her neighbor stepped outside. She sent letters to the HOA filled with dramatic warnings about deadly predators living among us. She even tried to rally a petition among the residents, but most neighbors had lived alongside the man for years without incident. They brushed her off, seeing her as overly dramatic. Still, Karen's persistence was relentless. She began patrolling her yard more frequently, peeking through her blinds at odd hours, determined to catch some sign of wrongdoing. Her obsession had turned personal, less about community safety and more about exerting control. Meanwhile, life inside the reptile owner's home carried on. He maintained his reptiles with care, keeping logs of feedings, shed cycles, and health checks. The snakes were more than pets. They were part of a carefully built passion. Every glass tank was locked, every latch double-checked. To him, Karen's complaints were nothing but noise. But what he didn't realize was how far her interference would eventually go. The turning point came late one evening when Karen spotted something near the fence. A movement, slow and deliberate, sliding through the grass. Her heart raced, and her worst suspicions ignited like fuel to fire. She was convinced that one of the snakes had finally gotten out. She hurried inside, pacing back and forth, imagining scenarios of it creeping into garages, sliding under her porch, or worse, slipping into her house. By the next morning, she was on the phone again, this time demanding immediate action from the HOA. She insisted that something had to be done, that the snakes were a menace to the neighborhood. Once again, her complaint was recorded, and once again, an inspection found nothing wrong. Her neighbor's enclosures were checked, all accounted for, all secure. But Karen refused to believe it. The tension grew thicker over the following weeks. Karen began telling people she could smell the snakes from across the street. She left passive-aggressive notes on community bulletin boards about irresponsible neighbors endangering lives. Her obsession had reached new heights, and still, the reptiles remained safely where they belonged. But then, as fate would have it, nature intervened. The neighborhood wasn't just home to exotic pets. The area was naturally rich with wildlife. Garter snakes, harmless and common, often lived in the tall grass and under rocks. On a warm afternoon, one such snake slipped unnoticed across Karen's pristine lawn. To her, however, it was evidence she had been right all along. When she spotted it, she froze, her face pale and her body rigid. The little snake slithered with calm disinterest, moving toward the shade by her porch. Karen gasped, convinced it had escaped from her neighbor's collection. In her mind, this was the very nightmare she had warned everyone about. She rushed back inside, her heart pounding. The image of scales burned into her thoughts. But her panic only grew worse when, later that evening, she heard a faint sound near her kitchen. A rustling, a scrape against the wall. She turned slowly, her eyes widening as she saw the unmistakable curve of a snake slipping along the floorboards. Her scream echoed through the quiet neighborhood, startling dogs and drawing a few curious looks from windows. For Karen, it was the moment she had feared most, the moment she had warned everyone about. And in her panic, she knew exactly who she would blame. The stage was set. The snake was in her house and Karen was ready to declare war. Karen's scream had been loud enough to make curtains twitch up and down the street. Neighbors peeked out, curious but cautious, unsure if it was another of her dramatic episodes or something serious. Inside her home, Karen was pacing in a frenzy. She slammed doors, shoved towels under cracks, and armed herself with a broom as if preparing for battle. In her mind, the nightmare had become real. One of her neighbor's snakes had invaded her sanctuary. The snake itself, a small garter snake, had no interest in confrontation. It had likely slithered inside through a crack near the foundation, drawn by warmth or the promise of shelter. It was harmless, but to Karen, its very presence was proof of danger. She cornered it near the laundry room, trembling as she swatted and jabbed at the floor. Finally, after a series of frantic blows, she managed to trap it beneath a bucket. She stood panting, her heart racing, her fear morphing into triumph. She had caught the evidence she needed. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood knew about the snake. Karen marched to the HOA office with her bucket, demanding to see the board members. She presented her catch like a crime scene exhibit, her voice rising as she described the terror of finding it slithering through her kitchen. She accused her neighbor of negligence, insisting that his reptiles had begun to escape. The HOA board, weary from her constant complaints, inspected the snake. To their knowledge, it looked nothing like the exotic snakes her neighbor kept. It was small, common, and clearly wild. They explained this to her, but Karen would not accept it. She insisted they were wrong, that this was only the beginning. She demanded immediate fines, forced removal, and even eviction of her neighbor if necessary. When the HOA declined to act, Karen turned to the neighbors. She stormed door to door, retelling her story with dramatic flair. She described the snake as long and menacing, claimed it hissed at her, and even said it tried to strike. Each telling grew more exaggerated, more terrifying. Some neighbors nodded sympathetically, but most exchanged uneasy looks once her back was turned. They had lived in the community long enough to recognize the difference between reality and Karen's embellished tales. But Karen was determined. She printed flyers warning of loose snakes in the neighborhood and slipped them into mailboxes. She wrote long posts in the community Facebook group, filled with dire warnings about children and pets being at risk. She even threatened to contact the media, convinced her story could spark outrage if only it reached the right audience. Meanwhile, across the street, her neighbor carried on quietly. He had heard the commotion, of course. He saw the flyers, the online posts, and the accusatory stares. He knew Karen had found a garter snake, but he also knew it had nothing to do with him. His reptiles remained secure, his paperwork in order, his conscience clear. To him, Karen's obsession was noise, frustrating, but ultimately baseless. Still, her persistence began to wear on the neighborhood. Parents walking their children grew uneasy after repeated warnings. Dog owners kept a closer eye on their pets. Conversations at the community park often circled back to Karen's claims, not because anyone fully believed her, but because the fear she stirred was contagious. The HOA, desperate to calm the situation, scheduled a special meeting. They invited both Karen and her neighbor to attend, hoping to resolve the matter. Karen arrived armed with binders of printed screenshots, photos of her bucketed garter snake, and handwritten notes describing every imagined encounter. Her neighbor, in contrast, came prepared with official documents, photos of his locked enclosures, and proof of inspections he had already passed. The meeting was tense. Karen spoke passionately, waving her arms and raising her voice as she painted pictures of snakes slithering through playgrounds and garages. She accused her neighbor of recklessness, called him selfish, and claimed he was endangering the community. The neighbor responded calmly, presenting his evidence, explaining his safety measures, and reminding the board of the harmless nature of the wild snake she had found. In the end, the board sided with the facts. They concluded that no rules had been broken, no snakes had escaped, and no action would be taken against the reptile owner. They reminded Karen that the community was also home to natural wildlife, and that finding a garter snake in the yard was no different from spotting a squirrel or bird. Karen was livid. She stormed out of the meeting, muttering threats under her breath, vowing that this was far from over. In her eyes, the board had been deceived. Her neighbors had turned a blind eye, and her adversary had gotten away with endangering everyone. Over the following days, her obsession grew darker. She began spying openly from her windows, keeping a notebook filled with times and dates of when her neighbor entered or exited his house. She convinced herself that if she watched long enough, she would catch him making a mistake. She started leaving her outdoor lights on all night, hoping to spot snakes crossing her lawn. She even bought repellents and sprinkled powders across her property, determined to keep the threat away. But paranoia has a way of feeding itself. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow in the grass, every squeak of the old pipes in her home became proof to Karen that snakes were invading. She slept poorly, jolting awake at imagined hisses. She checked under her bed, behind her couch, inside her closets. Her home, once a place of pride, had turned into a fortress of fear. And then, as though her fears were determined to taunt her, it happened again. On a humid evening, as she carried laundry through the hall, she spotted movement near the vent by her living room. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, impossibly, the shape of another snake emerged, its body curling along the edge of the floor. Her pulse quickened, her body trembling with horror and vindication all at once. Another snake was inside. To Karen, this was no coincidence. This was an invasion, and she knew exactly who to blame. The neighborhood drama was about to intensify, and this time Karen wasn't just complaining, she was preparing to retaliate. The second snake inside Karen's house tipped her from paranoia into full-blown fury. To her, it was no longer a question of chance or bad luck. This was proof, undeniable and terrifying, that her neighbor's reptiles were slipping free. She stood frozen in the hallway that evening, staring at the sinuous body curling along her living room wall. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her outrage anchored her feet. She retreated only far enough to grab her broom again, her weapon of choice against the imagined invasion. Her strikes were clumsy, punctuated by shrieks, but eventually the snake fled toward a vent and vanished into the dark. Karen collapsed onto the couch, her chest heaving, her anger boiling. This time, she promised herself there would be consequences. The following morning, she began her campaign in earnest. She stormed into the HOA office, her eyes wide, her hair disheveled, clutching the broom as though it were still part of the evidence. She shouted about negligence, demanded emergency fines, and accused her neighbor of harboring an illegal menagerie. The board members listened, weary but patient, reminding her once again that no violations had been found. But Karen was past reasoning. She accused them of corruption, claimed they were covering for her neighbor, and left with a final warning. If they wouldn't handle it, she would. Her retaliation began with small, almost petty acts. She started scattering mothballs and harsh-smelling repellents along the property line, letting the fumes drift across the street. She deliberately left trash bins open, hoping the smell would bother him. She even began blasting loud, shrill music from her porch during the evenings, certain it would disturb the snakes inside his house. But the most damaging tactic was her smear campaign. Karen took to social media with relentless energy, posting long rants about her neighbor's supposed recklessness. She described the snakes she found in her home as massive, venomous, and deadly, despite the fact they had been harmless garter snakes. She wrote that children's lives were at stake, that pets were being stalked, that it was only a matter of time before tragedy struck. She tagged local news outlets, hoping someone would pick up her story. The posts spread quickly. Some in the neighborhood dismissed them outright, rolling their eyes at her dramatics. But others, unfamiliar with snakes or already uneasy, began to wonder. Fear has a way of seeping into cracks, and Karen's words provided the fuel. Conversations at community gatherings grew tense. Parents began to question whether their children were safe playing outside. Dog walkers kept their pets closer to their sides. Her neighbor remained quiet, maintaining the same routine he always had. His reptiles stayed secured in their enclosures, his property neat, his presence calm. But Karen's constant attacks were beginning to erode the peace of the block. Every glance across the street carried tension. Every HOA notice felt heavier. The neighborhood was caught in the pull of her obsession, whether they wanted to be or not. When her online campaign failed to gain traction outside the neighborhood, Karen escalated again. She began prowling the edges of his yard late at night, armed with her phone, recording every sound and shadow she thought could be incriminating. She crouched near bushes, whispering commentary about escaped predators and proof of negligence. Most of her recordings showed nothing more than insects buzzing or the wind through the grass, but she edited them with dramatic captions and posted them anyway. The more she did this, the more she convinced herself she was right. In her mind, every creak of a branch was a slithering body, every flicker of motion was another reptile on the loose. Her obsession had devoured her sense of perspective. And then she made her most dangerous move yet. One evening, after another sleepless night filled with imagined hisses and shadows, Karen marched across the street. She carried a clipboard stuffed with papers she had printed from her online posts. She taped them to his fence, one after another, bold headlines accusing him of endangering children, pets, and the entire neighborhood. She scrawled warnings in thick black marker, phrases like reptile menace and danger lives here. By the next morning, the entire street had seen it. Cars slowed as they passed. Neighbors shook their heads, embarrassed at the spectacle. The HOA received a flood of calls, not about snakes, but about Karen's behavior. Some were sympathetic to her fear, but many were angry at the disruption, tired of the drama, and frustrated that the community's reputation was being dragged into chaos. The board finally issued a warning, not to the reptile enthusiast, but to Karen. They demanded she remove the signs, stop spreading misinformation, and cease harassing her neighbor. They reminded her that defamation and harassment were serious matters, and that her actions could result in fines or worse. But instead of backing down, Karen doubled down. She ripped the notice into pieces, declaring it proof that the board was protecting her neighbor. She told anyone who would listen that they were all blind, that they would regret ignoring her. In her mind, she wasn't harassing anyone. She was the only one brave enough to fight for the community's safety. Her neighbor, though patient, had his limits. Quietly, he began documenting everything. He saved copies of her posts, photos of the signs she taped to his fence, and video of her prowling near his property. He filed his own complaints with the HOA and even began consulting legal advice. He knew he had the law on his side, and he intended to use it if she pushed any further. But before legal action could unfold, nature delivered another twist. On a muggy night after a light rain, Karen once again spotted movement in her yard. This time it was unmistakable, a snake gliding slowly across the wet grass. She shrieked and stumbled backward, convinced her nightmare had escalated. Without thinking, she flung open her front door and rushed inside. But in her panic, she hadn't noticed where the snake was headed. It slid forward, drawn by the open doorway, and slipped across her threshold. By the time she realized it, the reptile was already inside. Her worst fear had returned, not once, but again. Another snake in her home. Her shrill cries filled the night, carrying across the quiet block as lights flicked on in house after house. Neighbors peeked out, some irritated, some worried, as Karen's voice rang out, "They're in my house again!" This time, however, the neighborhood was no longer on her side. The echoes of Karen's shrill cries lingered through the humid night, long after porch lights had clicked on up and down the street. Neighbors emerged in slippers and robes, their patience fraying after weeks of spectacle. They gathered in small clusters on driveways, whispering to one another as Karen's frantic voice carried from inside her home. This was no longer the concern of snakes. It had become a neighborhood spectacle, an exhausting theater of one woman's obsession. Inside her house, Karen's panic had escalated into chaos. She darted from room to room, convinced the snake was stalking her. She shoved furniture aside, slammed doors, and flung open cabinets as if the creature might be hiding behind every surface. Her broom swung wildly, knocking trinkets to the floor. Each noise fueled her hysteria further, until she could barely distinguish between real rustles and the echoes of her own movements. But unlike the previous incidents, this time her neighbors had grown tired of her solo crusade. A few gathered closer to her front lawn, muttering among themselves about calling animal control, not for the snake, but to bring an end to the ongoing drama. Others shook their heads, muttering that it was always something with Karen. The sympathy she once courted had withered into annoyance. Finally, headlights cut through the scene. A white municipal vehicle rolled to a stop, and two officers from animal control stepped out. They had been called after multiple reports of a dangerous snake loose inside a residence. Their arrival drew a small crowd of curious onlookers. For many neighbors, this was the culmination of weeks of tension, and they weren't going to miss the outcome. Karen burst through her front door as the officers approached, her face pale, her hair damp with sweat. She pointed inside, her words tumbling over each other in frantic succession. She described a massive serpent gliding across her floors, striking at her ankles, hiding under furniture. Her arms waved dramatically, her voice rising until it bordered on shrieking. The officers nodded calmly, their expressions neutral, and stepped into her home with practiced composure. They began their inspection, moving methodically from room to room, checking corners, vents, and under furniture. The crowd outside waited, whispers passing like sparks through dry grass. Karen paced on the porch, wringing her hands, glancing back at her neighbor's house with fiery glares. It didn't take long. Within minutes, one of the officers re-emerged, holding the dangerous predator delicately by the tail. The crowd leaned forward, squinting to see. And then came the truth, revealed plainly for all to witness. Another harmless garter snake. Small, thin, and utterly non-threatening, wriggling calmly in the officer's grip. A murmur rippled through the gathered neighbors. Some chuckled softly, others shook their heads in disbelief. The tension broke into a collective sigh of exasperation. After weeks of drama, endless complaints, and wild accusations, the reality was so anticlimactic it bordered on absurd. Karen, however, refused to accept it. She protested loudly, insisting that the snake must have come from her neighbor's house, that this was evidence of his irresponsibility. She demanded the officers search across the street, demanded they seize his reptiles, demanded justice for her suffering. But the officers, professional and unshaken, explained that the garter snake was a native species, common in the area, and not connected to her neighbor's pets in any way. The crowd began to shift uncomfortably as Karen's tirade continued. Her words, once persuasive in their urgency, now sounded shrill and hollow against the weight of evidence. Neighbors who had once humored her crossed their arms, their faces hard with disapproval. A few even spoke up, telling her to calm down, reminding her that the snakes she kept finding were wild and harmless. Her neighbor, who had remained quiet on his porch during the spectacle, finally stood. He carried a folder in hand, the same folder he had been compiling for weeks. Inside were screenshots of her online posts, photos of her signs, HOA notices, and records of her harassment. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gloat, but simply handed the folder to one of the HOA board members present in the crowd. His calm demeanor, in contrast to Karen's hysteria, painted the scene in stark relief. That moment shifted the narrative entirely. The problem wasn't snakes, it was Karen. The HOA, already frustrated by the disruption, now had what they needed. Within days, a formal notice was delivered to Karen's mailbox. It detailed her violations of community rules, harassment, defamation, and disorderly conduct. She was fined heavily and warned that further incidents could lead to legal consequences. Her smear campaign had backfired, leaving her isolated and embarrassed. Neighbors who once entertained her warnings stopped answering her calls. Her posts online were ignored or mocked. Children whispered about the snake lady when passing her house, giggling behind their hands. Karen, once eager to patrol the neighborhood like a self-appointed guardian, found herself shunned by the very community she claimed to protect. Meanwhile, her neighbor's life returned to quiet normalcy. His reptiles remained secure, admired only by those who shared his appreciation for them. The whispers about danger faded as quickly as they had spread. The HOA, eager to restore peace, even issued a statement reassuring residents that no exotic pets had ever escaped and that the neighborhood was safe. But Karen never fully let go. She kept her lights burning at night, her blinds tilted just so, always watching across the street. Every rustle of leaves still made her flinch. Every shadow fed her lingering fear. Yet no matter how tightly she clung to her suspicions, the neighborhood had moved on without her. In the end, the snakes had not undone the community. Karen had. Her crusade, born from fear and fueled by obsession, had turned her into the very menace she claimed to fight against. And while the reptiles remained silent behind their locked enclosures, it was Karen's voice, shrill, relentless, and ignored, that haunted the quiet suburban nights.